The video uses AI voice images combined with manual editing. All content is fictional and for entertainment purposes only. Wishing you a relaxing listening experience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. The skyline of Boston was a jagged saw blade against the bruised purple of dusk. From the penthouse of the Falcone Tower, Antonio Falcone surveyed the city that belonged to him. He was a man carved from ice and marble, his dark eyes missing nothing, his heart an impenetrable fortress built over years of betrayal and bloodshed. At 34, he was the undisputed head of the Falcone syndicate, a position earned not just by blood, but by a ruthless, calculated intellect. Yet, power came with a price, a relentless target on his back. The Moretti family, a rival faction from Chicago, was encroaching on his territory, their methods loud, messy, and increasingly desperate. Antonio turned away from the glass. His consigliere, an older man named Silas, stood waiting, a leather folder in his hand. "The Morettis are pressing hard, Antonio," Silas said, his voice gravelly. "They think you're vulnerable because you're unattached. A man without a family is a man without a legacy, or so the old guard believes. It emboldens them." Antonio scoffed, a short, sharp sound. "I don't need a wife to secure my legacy. I need loyalty." "You need a deterrent," Silas countered softly. "A public alliance, a marriage. It settles the restless factions. It shows stability." Silas held out the folder. "I've found a suitable candidate, from outside the life, but with enough complication to ensure her compliance." Antonio flipped the folder open. A photograph stared back at him. Nina Fisher, 28, an architectural restorer. The woman in the photo had intelligent, guarded green eyes and a dusting of freckles across her nose. She looked entirely unremarkable, entirely ordinary, exactly what he didn't want. "Why her?" "Her father," Silas explained. "He ran up a significant debt, gambling, bad investments. He owes the syndicate, not us directly, but a subsidiary we control. A debt he can never repay. He's facing ruin, perhaps worse. She's fiercely protective of him." Antonio studied the face again. An ordinary woman, desperate to save her father. Perfect. She would be compliant. She would be quiet. She would be a decoy, a public face to appease the old guard, a shield to deflect the Moretti's attention while he dismantled them in the shadows. He didn't want a partner. He wanted a tactical advantage. 3 days later, Nina Fisher sat in a cold, sterile conference room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She had spent the last year watching her father crumble under the weight of his debts, his health failing alongside his finances. When the men in dark suits had arrived, she expected violence. Instead, they offered an impossible bargain. The door opened and Antonio Falcone walked in. The air in the room seemed to turn frigid. He was taller than she expected, broad-shouldered and impeccably dressed, radiating a quiet, terrifying authority. He didn't introduce himself. He simply sat across from her and pushed a thick contract across the table. "The terms are simple," Antonio said, his voice a low, smooth baritone that offered no warmth. "We marry. We maintain a public facade of a happy union. You attend events, you smile for the cameras. In exchange, your father's debt is wiped clean, and he receives a stipend to live comfortably, provided he remains silent." Nina looked at the document, then up at him. She was terrified, but she refused to let it show. She had spent her life painstakingly restoring broken things. She knew how to handle fragility, even her own. "And my life?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady. "What happens to my work, my independence?" "You will be Mrs. Falcone," Antonio replied, a hint of dismissal in his tone. "Your needs will be provided for. Your architectural pursuits, you may continue them quietly, provided they do not interfere with your obligations to me. You will be safe. But you will be mine, in name." Nina saw the emptiness in his eyes. He didn't see her as a person. He saw her as a transaction, a pawn. But she had no choice. Her father's life depended on it. She picked up the pen, her hand trembling only slightly, and signed her name. "Good," Antonio said, standing abruptly. "We announce the engagement tomorrow. Do not make me regret this, Miss Fisher." He walked out, leaving her alone with the ink drying on the page that had just signed away her life. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, Nina stared at her signature. She had just sold herself to the devil to save her father. But as she touched the cold paper, a small, stubborn spark ignited within her. He thought she was a pawn. He thought she would break. He didn't know the first thing about restoring a foundation that was meant to last. The engagement announcement went exactly as planned. The press ate up the story of the powerful businessman and the quiet restorer. But as Nina was moved into the vast, echoing Falcone estate, she realized the true depth of her isolation. She was a ghost in his house, a shadow in his life. But shadows, she thought, could also observe. They could learn. And she was about to learn everything about the man who held her leash. The Falcone estate, perched on the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic just outside Boston, was a masterpiece of cold, modern architecture. It was vast, silent, and suffocating. Nina's days bled into one another, marked only by the arrival of specialized tailors, etiquette coaches, and the ever-present security detail. Antonio was a phantom, a presence felt rather than seen. They shared brief, stilted dinners where silence was the main course, and he departed for his study before the plates were cleared. Nina refused to let the isolation break her. She retreated into her work, converting a sunroom into a makeshift studio. She poured her anxiety into restoring an antique clock she'd brought from her small apartment. The meticulous work of cleaning gears and aligning springs grounded her. It was a tangible puzzle she could solve, unlike the enigma of her new husband. One evening, 3 weeks into their arrangement, Antonio surprised her by joining her in the sunroom. The scent of sandalwood and something distinctly metallic accompanied him. He stood in the doorway, watching her carefully reassemble the clock's escapement mechanism. "You have steady hands," he remarked, his voice startling her slightly. Nina didn't look up, focusing entirely on the delicate task. "You have to, in this work. A single slip can ruin hours of progress." She secured a tiny screw. "It's about patience, understanding how the pieces fit together before forcing them." Antonio crossed the room, leaning against the edge of her work table. He looked exhausted, the shadows under his eyes darker than usual. "Patience is a luxury I rarely afford. Perhaps you should try it," Nina said softly, finally meeting his gaze. "Rushing a repair usually means you're just masking the break, not fixing it." For a moment, something flickered in Antonio's eyes, a flash of surprise, perhaps even amusement. It was the most human expression she had seen on him. He looked down at the intricate gears. "And what are you fixing, Nina?" "Right now?" "Time," she replied, a faint smile playing on her lips. "At least I'm trying to make it run smoothly again." The moment shattered as the sharp ring of Antonio's encrypted phone cut through the quiet. His posture instantly stiffened. He glanced at the screen, his expression hardening back into the icy mask. He turned without a word and strode out of the room. The fragile connection was gone, replaced by the familiar chill of the house. The following week, the public facade began. Antonio informed her they were attending a charity gala hosted by a prominent state senator. It was a crucial event for maintaining appearances. Nina was dressed in a stunning, midnight blue gown, a necklace of diamonds heavy against her throat. As they arrived at the venue, a barrage of flashbulbs blinded her. Antonio's hand rested lightly on her lower back, a possessive, territorial gesture that felt entirely performative. Inside the ballroom, the air was thick with perfume, expensive liquor, and veiled threats. Nina quickly realized she was not a guest. She was a prop. Antonio introduced her to politicians, businessmen, and figures who carried an undeniable aura of danger. He kept his conversations brief, his focus constantly shifting, analyzing the room. He rarely spoke to her, leaving her to endure the polite, shallow chatter of the other wives. It was during a tedious conversation with a socialite about floral arrangements that Nina overheard a snippet of conversation behind her. Two men, their voices hushed but intense, were standing near a pillar. "The shipment at the docks," one man muttered. "Moretti's people are making a move tonight. They know Falcone is here. Distracted. It's a perfect blind spot." "Are you sure?" "If we tip off, keep quiet. If Falcone loses the shipment, he looks weak. Let Moretti have this one." Nina's blood ran cold. She didn't understand the intricacies of the syndicate, but she understood betrayal. She understood that the man whose hand currently rested on her arm was being targeted while he was forced to play the devoted husband. She looked at Antonio. He was engaged in a tense conversation with a city alderman, completely unaware of the threat brewing at the docks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She was supposed to be a decoy, a shield, but she was also an observer, and she had just observed something that could hurt him. She waited for a lull in his conversation, then stepped close to him, slipping her arm through his. The gesture felt surprisingly natural, even though it was an act. She leaned up, putting her lips near his ear, pretending to whisper a sweet nothing for the benefit of the onlookers. "Antonio," she breathed, her voice trembling slightly but urgent. "The docks. Moretti's people are moving on a shipment tonight. I overheard two men near the pillar. They said you were distracted." Antonio's body went completely rigid. For a fraction of a second, his grip on her arm tightened painfully. He didn't turn to look at the men she mentioned. His expression remained perfectly neutral, a masterclass in control. He turned to her, a terrifyingly serene smile on his face. "Is that so, mia cara?" he murmured, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear a term of endearment, but his eyes locked onto hers with a frightening intensity. "You are quite the attentive wife." He abruptly pulled away, his posture rigid. "Excuse me," he told the alderman. "A minor business matter requires my immediate attention." He didn't wait for her. He simply turned and vanished into the crowd, leaving Nina alone in the sea of sharks. She had warned him. She had chosen a side. But as she watched him disappear, she couldn't shake the chilling thought. Had she just saved his life, or painted a target on her own back? The charity gala dragged on for hours after Antonio left. Nina remained, a silent mannequin in diamonds, maintaining the facade. She fielded intrusive questions about her husband's sudden departure, with practiced, vague smiles, her stomach churning with anxiety. She didn't know what was happening at the docks. She didn't know if Antonio was safe. She only knew the cold dread settling over her. When the limousine finally returned her to the estate, the house was dark and eerily quiet. She retreated to her bedroom, shedding the heavy gown and scrubbing the makeup from her face. Sleep was impossible. She sat by the window, watching the waves crash against the cliffs below, the rhythmic violence matching her internal turmoil. It was nearly 3 a.m. when she heard the heavy, muffled sound of the front doors opening. Footsteps echoed in the grand foyer, not the precise, measured stride of Antonio, but something heavier, erratic. She crept to her door, opening it just a crack. Antonio stood at the bottom of the grand staircase. His tuxedo jacket was gone, his white shirt torn and stained with dark, blooming patches of red. He was leaning heavily against the banister, his breathing ragged. Silas was beside him, speaking in urgent, hushed tones, pressing a white cloth to Antonio's side. Nina didn't think. She acted. She pushed her door open and hurried down the stairs, her bare feet silent on the marble. "Antonio!" He snapped his head up, his eyes wild and unfocused for a moment before landing on her. "Get back to your room, Nina," he growled, his voice tight with pain. "This doesn't concern you." "You're bleeding," she said, ignoring his command and reaching the bottom step. She looked at Silas. "What happened?" "An ambush," Silas said grimly, helping Antonio towards the private elevator. "The information you provided was accurate, Mrs. Falcone, but Moretti had more men waiting than anticipated. We secured the shipment, but—" He glanced pointedly at Antonio's side. "We need to get him to the medical suite, now." Nina followed them, refusing to be dismissed. The medical suite in the basement was fully equipped, a stark reminder of the reality of Antonio's world. An underground doctor, a man whose face she didn't recognize, was already waiting. She stood in the corner, her arms wrapped around herself, watching as they stripped Antonio of his ruined shirt. The wound was ugly, a deep laceration along his ribs, jagged and bleeding profusely. The doctor worked quickly, cleaning and stitching the wound. Antonio didn't make a sound, but his jaw was clenched so tightly a muscle jumped in his cheek, and his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the examining table. It was brutal, visceral, and terrifying. Yet Nina couldn't look away. For the first time, she saw the vulnerability beneath the armor. He wasn't invincible. He was flesh and blood, and he was hurting. When the doctor finished and left with Silas to discuss further security measures, Nina was left alone with Antonio. He was lying back on the table, his eyes closed, his skin pale against the stark white sheets. He looked exhausted, older than his 34 years. She cautiously approached the table. She reached out, hesitating for a moment, before gently resting her hand on his uninjured shoulder. The contact was slight, but she felt the immediate tension in his muscles. He opened his eyes. They were dark pools of pain and something else. Suspicion. "Why are you still here?" "Because you're hurt," she replied simply, keeping her hand steady. "I'm used to pain," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "I don't need pity." "It's not pity," Nina said softly. "It's understanding. You build these walls, Antonio, to keep everyone out, to convince them you're unbreakable. But right now, you look very human." He scoffed weakly. "Humanity is a weakness in my world, Nina, a vulnerability." "Perhaps," she countered. "But pretending it doesn't exist is a lie. And eventually, a structure built on lies will collapse." He looked at her, truly looked at her, for what felt like the first time. The suspicion in his eyes softened, replaced by a weary curiosity. "You warned me tonight." "Why?" Nina pulled her hand back, stepping slightly away. "Because despite what you think of me, I am not your enemy. And I don't want to see you killed." "You saved my life tonight, Nina," he said, the words heavy and deliberate. "And in my world, a life saved is a debt owed. You have proven yourself useful. Useful." The word stung. He still saw her through the lens of transactions and debts. "I didn't do it for a reward, Antonio," she said, her voice tightening. "I did it because it was the right thing to do." She turned and walked towards the door, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. As she reached the handle, his voice stopped her. "Nina." She looked back. "Thank you." The words were quiet, reluctant, but genuine. It was a small crack in the fortress. But as Nina returned to her room, she knew that in Antonio Falcone's world, a debt owed was a powerful thing, and she had just made herself far more valuable than a simple shield. The next morning, the house was suffocatingly tense. Security had been doubled. Men in dark suits patrolled the perimeter. Antonio was confined to his study, nursing his injury behind closed doors. Nina felt the shift in the atmosphere, the immediate aftermath of violence, the quiet before the next storm. She sought refuge in her sunroom, returning to the antique clock. She found comfort in the predictable mechanics, the logical progression of gears. But her mind kept replaying the events of the previous night. The blood, the pain, the brief, unexpected moment of connection. Mid-morning, Silas entered the sunroom. He looked older, the lines on his face etched deeper by a sleepless night. "Mrs. Falcone," he said formally, "Antonio requests your presence in his study." Nina's heart skipped a beat. She wiped her hands on a rag and followed Silas through the maze of corridors. The study was a large, dark room, lined with bookshelves and smelling of leather and cigar smoke. Antonio was seated behind his massive mahogany desk, looking pale but resolute. The bandage beneath his shirt was visible where the collar remained unbuttoned. He motioned for her to sit in one of the leather armchairs opposite him. "We need to discuss the implications of last night," he began, his voice lacking its usual commanding edge. "I understand the Morettis are a threat," Nina said cautiously. "A significant one," Antonio agreed. "But what happened last night changes things. You were not supposed to be involved. You were supposed to be safe, insulated from the reality of this life." "I'm not naive, Antonio. I knew what I was signing up for. Did you?" He leaned forward slightly, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitches. "You signed up to be a public face. You did not sign up to be an informant. The information you provided saved my shipment and likely my life. But it also exposed you." Nina frowned. "How?" "The men you overheard," Antonio explained, his gaze intense. "They were low-level associates, but they are dead now. Word will spread that there was a leak at the gala. It won't take long for Moretti to trace it back to the only person who was near them and who had a direct line to me." The reality of his words crashed over her. "You think they'll target me?" "I don't think, I know," Antonio said grimly. "Moretti is a desperate man, and desperate men target vulnerabilities. By warning me, you stepped out of the role of the quiet, unremarkable wife. You made yourself a player on the board. You are no longer just a shield, Nina. You are a target." The air in the study felt leaden. Nina stared at Antonio, the weight of his words pressing down on her. A target. The abstraction of danger she had felt since signing the contract suddenly solidified into a very real, very present threat. She had sought to save him, but in doing so, she had painted a bullseye on her own back. "So what happens now?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice level. "Now everything changes," Antonio stated. "Your security detail will be tripled. You will not leave the estate without my explicit permission, and when you do, it will be under heavy guard. Your phone will be monitored, your internet access restricted." Nina felt a suffocating panic rising. This wasn't just a gilded cage anymore. It was a solitary confinement cell. "You're locking me away." "I am keeping you alive," he countered, his tone hardening. "You do not understand the rules of this game, Nina. If Moretti gets to you, he will use you to break me. I cannot allow that." "You mean you cannot allow your shield to be broken?" she retorted, the fear bleeding into anger. I'm still just a tool to you, aren't I? A liability to be managed. Antonio's jaw clenched. He looked at her, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes wavered. You are my wife. In name, yes. But the title carries weight. Protecting you is protecting my own strength. He leaned back, the conversation clearly over. Silas will brief you on the new protocols. The next few weeks were a descent into claustrophobia. The estate, once a lonely sanctuary, became a fortress. Guards were everywhere, silent sentinels tracking her every move. The quiet she had previously endured now felt oppressive, pregnant with unspoken threats. Antonio grew even more distant. The brief moment of vulnerability they had shared in the medical suite vanished, replaced by an impenetrable wall. He was consumed by the escalating war with the Morettis, spending his days locked in meetings with his capos, his nights poring over documents in his study. When they did cross paths, his interactions were brief, transactional, and devoid of warmth. Nina felt herself retreating. She spent hours in her sunroom, pouring her frustration into the intricate restorations. It was her only act of rebellion, the only space she controlled. She finished the clock, its rhythmic ticking a stark contrast to the chaotic silence of the house. One rainy afternoon, she ventured into the estate's expansive library, seeking a distraction from the relentless tick-tock of her thoughts. The room was dark, smelling of old paper and dust. As she browsed the shelves, her hand brushed against a leather-bound journal tucked carelessly behind a row of encyclopedias. Curiosity piqued. She pulled it out. It was old, the pages yellowed, the handwriting was cramped, precise, and undeniably Antonio's. It wasn't a ledger or a diary of syndicate business. It was something far more personal. She hesitated, knowing she was invading his privacy, but the desperate need to understand the man who held her captive overruled her caution. She opened the journal. It contained sketches, detailed, meticulous architectural drawings of buildings, bridges, cathedrals. They were breathtaking, filled with an understanding of structure and form that mirrored her own passion. But interspersed with the drawings were notes, written in a younger, more frantic hand. They demand blood, but I see only bone. The structure must hold. If the foundation is weak, the entire edifice crumbles. I cannot build upon rot. Another betrayal. The mortar is cracking. I must be the steel. I must unyielding. Nina sat in one of the plush armchairs, captivated. This wasn't the ruthless Mafia boss she knew. This was a man who saw the world as a fragile structure constantly threatening to collapse. He wasn't naturally cold. He had deliberately hardened himself, becoming the steel to survive the rot of his world. A sharp intake of breath shattered the quiet. Nina looked up. Antonio stood in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes locked onto the journal in her hands. The silence stretched, tight and dangerous. "What are you doing?" His voice was dangerously low, vibrating with a suppressed fury she hadn't heard before. Nina slowly closed the journal, not breaking eye contact. "I was looking for a book. I found this." He crossed the room in 3 long strides, snatching the journal from her grasp. "This is private. You have no right." "I didn't know what it was," she defended herself, standing up. "But I see it now. You're not just a mob boss, Antonio. You're an architect." "I am what I had to become," he snarled, tossing the journal onto a nearby table. He turned his back to her, his shoulders rigid. "Those are the scribblings of a child who thought he could build something beautiful in a world that only destroys." "You still think like an architect," Nina insisted, stepping closer. "You talk about foundations, about structures. You see the syndicate not as a family, but as a building you have to constantly reinforce. He whipped around, his eyes blazing. And what do you know about it? You sit in your sunroom, fixing broken toys. You don't understand the pressure of holding up a crumbling empire. You don't understand the sacrifices required. I understand that you're suffocating, Nina shot back, her own voice rising. You've built these walls so thick you can't even breathe yourself. You push everyone away because you're terrified they'll find the cracks. For a moment, they stood toe-to-toe, the air crackling between them. The furious mask slipped, revealing the exhausted, cornered man beneath. "If they find the cracks, Nina," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "they tear the whole building down, and everyone inside it dies." The reality of his burden hit her with physical force. He wasn't just protecting his power, he believed he was protecting his people. He was trapped by his own strength. Before she could respond, the heavy mahogany doors of the library slammed open. Silas stood there, his face ashen, his usual calm completely shattered. "Antonio," Silas gasped. "It's your brother, it's Leo." Antonio's entire demeanor changed instantly. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by cold, terrifying calculation. "What about Leo?" "There was an explosion," Silas said, his voice trembling. "At the warehouse in the South End. Leo was there. Antonio didn't ask if his brother was alive. He simply strode past Nina, his face a mask of absolute, unforgiving vengeance." The silence that followed his departure was louder than any scream. The silence in the Falcone estate following the news of Leo's death was different. It wasn't the oppressive, watchful quiet of before. It was the deafening silence of a bomb going off, leaving a vacuum in its wake. Leo, Antonio's younger brother, the reckless, charismatic heart of the Falcone family, was gone. Antonio became a wraith. He barely slept, barely ate. The meticulously maintained facade of control crumbled, revealing a terrifying, raw grief that he channeled entirely into rage. He was consumed by the need for retaliation against the Morettis, whom he blamed entirely for the ambush. The estate transformed into a war room, filled with grim-faced men discussing violent logistics in hushed, urgent tones. Nina was entirely marginalized, a ghost haunting her own gilded cage. She tried to offer comfort, a quiet presence, but Antonio rejected her every attempt. He looked at her not with suspicion, but with a blank emptiness that was far more painful. She was a reminder of his vulnerability, a weakness he could no longer afford to indulge. The isolation gnawed at her. She spent hours in the library, rereading Antonio's journal, trying to find the man who understood structure and foundation amidst the chaos of his current destruction. One evening, unable to bear the suffocating atmosphere of her room, she slipped down to the kitchen. It was late, the house dark except for the faint glow of the security monitors in Silas's office. She needed water, anything to break the monotony of her racing thoughts. As she poured a glass, she heard a sound from the adjacent dining room, a low, muffled groan. She crept to the doorway, peering into the shadows. Antonio was slumped at the head of the massive, empty dining table. He held a half-empty bottle of scotch in one hand, the other resting heavily on the table, his head bowed. He looked utterly defeated. Nina hesitated. He had pushed her away so violently over the past week. But seeing him like this, the powerful Mafia boss reduced to a broken man seeking solace in a bottle, she couldn't retreat. She stepped into the room. Antonio didn't look up. "Leave me, Silas. I said I wanted to be alone." His words were slightly slurred, thick with alcohol and grief. "It's not Silas," Nina said softly. He slowly raised his head. His eyes were bloodshot, his face gaunt. The terrifying mask was completely gone, leaving only the raw, bleeding wound of a brother's loss. "Nina," he rasped. "What are you doing here?" "I couldn't sleep," she admitted, moving slowly toward the table, as if approaching a wounded animal. "And neither can you." He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Sleep is for the innocent. I have a war to plan." He took a deep swallow from the bottle. "You're destroying yourself, Antonio," she said gently, pulling out a chair a few feet away from him. "I am destroying the Morettis," he corrected, his voice hardening for a moment before cracking. "They took Leo. They took the only piece of my foundation that wasn't built on blood and lies." The word struck a chord. She remembered the journal. "I must be the steel. You tried to protect him by being strong for both of you," she murmured. He stared at the bottle in his hand. "I failed. I built the walls too high, too thick. I was so focused on the perimeter, I didn't see the rot from within." He looked up at her, a profound despair in his eyes. "It wasn't an external ambush, Nina. The warehouse was secure. It was an inside job." Nina felt a chill crawl up her spine. "Someone betrayed you?" He nodded slowly. "Someone close. Someone who knew Leo's schedule. I've suspected it for days. But the evidence, it points to a horrific truth." He leaned forward, resting his forehead on his hand. "I am surrounded by traitors, and I cannot see the truth." "You can't see it because you're looking through the lens of grief and anger," Nina said, her voice firm despite the fear fluttering in her stomach. "You're reacting, not analyzing." He looked at her, a spark of defiance breaking through his exhaustion. "And what would you know about analysis? You fix clocks." "I fix broken systems," she corrected him. "I look at how the pieces interact. When a mechanism fails, you don't just smash it with a hammer. You examine the stress points, the friction. You look for the piece that isn't pulling its weight." She stood up and walked closer to him, stopping just out of arm's reach. "You're convinced someone betrayed you, but have you considered why? Betrayal rarely happens in a vacuum. It's usually a symptom of a deeper structural flaw." Antonio was silent, his dark eyes fixed on her. He was listening. It was the first time in a week he had truly engaged with anyone. "You lead by fear, Antonio," she continued, emboldened by his silence. "You build loyalty through debt and intimidation. But fear is brittle. It shatters under pressure. True loyalty is built on trust, on mutual respect. If someone betrayed you, it's because the fear wasn't enough anymore. You need to look not just for who pulled the trigger, but who provided the motive." He stared at her for a long time, the silence stretching between them. Finally, he set the bottle down. "You think I am the architect of my own destruction?" "I think you built a fortress without any doors," she replied. "And now you're trapped inside with the very people who want to burn it down." Antonio leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful frown creasing his forehead. The drunken fog seemed to have lifted slightly, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. "Silas," he murmured, almost to himself. Silas was the only one who knew the exact timing of the shipment last month, and he was the one who diverted Leo to the warehouse today. Nina gasped. "Silas, your consigliere. But he's been with your family for years." "Years of service can breed resentment just as easily as loyalty," Antonio said quietly. He stood up, his posture straightening, the grief replaced by a terrifying, focused resolve. He looked at Nina, and for the first time, there was no condescension in his gaze. There was something resembling respect. "You see the gears," he said softly. "You see how they interact. You are right, Nina. I have been blind." He stepped closer to her, so close she could smell the scotch and the sharp tang of his aftershave. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, a fleeting, almost hesitant caress. I told you that you were a target. But perhaps you are the only one who can see clearly. He dropped his hand and turned away, his mind already racing with a new plan. Stay in your room tomorrow. Do not trust anyone. Not even the guards. As he strode out of the dining room, Nina felt a complex mix of fear and strange validation. She had finally cracked the armor. She had reached the man beneath the monster. But as the reality of Silas's potential betrayal set in, she realized the terrifying truth. The foundation of Antonio's empire wasn't just cracking, it was already falling apart. And she was standing right in the middle of the collapse. The estate felt different the next morning. The oppressive tension remained, but it had shifted from outward aggression to inward paranoia. Antonio was locked in his study again, but this time he wasn't planning an assault on the Morettis. He was dissecting his own organization. Nina followed his instructions. She stayed in her room, the silence gnawing at her. The revelation about Silas was horrifying. The man who had brokered her marriage, the man who seemed to be Antonio's most trusted advisor, might be the orchestrator of his brother's death. It made everyone suspect. It made every shadow a potential threat. By mid-afternoon, the confinement became unbearable. She needed to move, to think. She slipped out of her room, intending to find refuge in her sunroom. As she navigated the quiet corridors, she heard voices coming from the formal sitting room, a space rarely used. She approached cautiously, keeping to the shadows. The door was slightly ajar. She peered through the crack. Silas was standing near the fireplace, his back to the door. Facing him was a man Nina recognized from the charity gala, a lieutenant in the Falcone syndicate named Marco. Marco looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "Antonio is unstable," Marco was saying, his voice a low hiss. "He's lost focus. The Morettis are preparing a massive push, and he's chasing ghosts within our own ranks. Let him chase," Silas replied calmly, his tone chillingly detached. "His paranoia is working to our advantage. He's isolating himself, alienating his capos. He's doing the work for us." Nina held her breath, her heart hammering violently. Antonio had been right. The rot was deep. "But what if he finds out?" Marco asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "He suspects something. He knows Leo's death wasn't a random hit. He suspects everyone, which means he suspects no one," Silas reasoned. "We stay the course. The Morettis strike tonight at the central distribution hub. Antonio will be forced to respond personally. It will be messy. When the dust settles, the syndicate will need strong, stable leadership. A new foundation. And the wife?" Marco asked. Nina's blood ran cold. Silas waved a dismissive hand. "A complication we will deal with when the time comes. She is a pawn, easily removed from the board once her usefulness has expired." Nina stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. She turned and ran, the silent carpet absorbing her frantic footsteps. She had to find Antonio. She had to tell him. She reached his study, ignoring the guards posted outside, and threw the heavy doors open. Antonio looked up from his desk, his expression instantly hardening at the intrusion. "I told you to stay in your room." "Silas?" Nina gasped, leaning against the doorframe, struggling to catch her breath. "It's Silas," I heard him. Antonio stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing. "What did you hear?" Nina quickly relayed the conversation she had overheard between Silas and Marco. She detailed the planned attack on the distribution hub that night, Silas's intention to let Antonio fail, and his ultimate plan to seize control of the syndicate. She watched Antonio's face, expecting an explosion of rage. Instead, an eerie calm settled over him. It was the terrifying stillness of a predator that had finally located its prey. "So," he murmured, his voice deadly quiet, "the architect of deceit reveals himself." "Antonio, they're planning a trap for you tonight," Nina pleaded, her voice trembling. "You can't go to the hub. It's a suicide mission." "I know," he said simply. Nina stared at him, confused. "You know? Then why?" He walked around the desk, approaching her. "Because, Nina, in order to catch a rat, you must lay out the cheese. I have suspected Silas for days, as we discussed. But I needed proof. I needed to know the extent of the rot. Your information confirms my suspicions and provides the timeline. But they're expecting you to respond. If you go, they'll kill you." "I am not going to the distribution hub," Antonio said, a dark, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "I am going to let Marco believe his plan is working. I will send a minimal force to the hub, just enough to make it look convincing. But my main forces, they will be here." Nina felt a cold knot form in her stomach. "Here, Silas believes I am isolated, weak, and paranoid," Antonio explained. "He expects me to rush out to defend the hub, leaving the estate vulnerable. He intends to strike the head of the snake while the body is distracted." He stopped in front of her, his gaze intense. "He is coming here tonight, Nina, to finish what he started with Leo." The reality of the situation crashed over her. The sanctuary was becoming a war zone. "And what about me? You said I was a complication, easily removed." For a moment, the coldness in Antonio's eyes vanished, replaced by a fierce, undeniable protectiveness. He reached out and grasped her shoulders, his grip strong but not painful. "You are not a pawn, Nina," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "You are my wife, and no one touches what is mine." He let go of her and turned back to his desk, all business once again. "We have hours to prepare. The estate will become a fortress. You will be secured in the panic room in the basement. It is impregnable." "No," Nina said, the word slipping out before she could stop it. Antonio spun around, his eyes blazing. "No! This is not a request, Nina. This is a command. You will be safe. I won't be locked away in a box while you fight," she argued, her fear morphing into a stubborn defiance. "I'm tired of being a spectator in my own life. I'm tired of being a liability. You are a liability if you are out here," he roared, slamming his hand on the desk. "You don't understand this world. You don't know how to survive it." "I understand structures, Antonio," she shouted back. "I understand how things break and how they hold together. Silas thinks he knows every weakness in your organization, but he doesn't know me. He thinks I'm irrelevant. Let me be the variable he hasn't calculated for." They stood glaring at each other, the air thick with tension. Antonio saw the fierce determination in her eyes, a reflection of the steel he possessed himself. She wasn't just a quiet restorer anymore. The fire of his world had forged something new within her. He let out a long, heavy sigh, the fight draining out of him. "What do you propose?" "Silas controls the security monitors from his office," Nina said, her mind racing, analyzing the problem like a broken clock mechanism. "If he strikes tonight, he'll lock down the system, blind your men, and control the doors. You need someone inside that room to override his commands. Someone he won't suspect until it's too late." Antonio stared at her, assessing her plan, assessing her. It was incredibly dangerous. It was reckless. But it was also strategically sound. "It's a huge risk, Nina," he warned softly. "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But I'm tired of being your shield, Antonio. Let me be your weapon." He looked at her, truly seeing the woman beneath the facade he had forced upon her. The ordinary woman had vanished, replaced by an exceptional partner. "All right," he said quietly. "We play your way. But if things go wrong—" He didn't finish the sentence. The implication hung heavily in the air. The trap was set. The bait was laid. And as the sun began to set over the Atlantic, plunging the estate into shadows, Nina prepared to step out of the background and into the crossfire. The night descended like a heavy curtain. The estate was eerily silent, the calm before the storm. Antonio had positioned his loyal men strategically, hidden within the shadows of the mansion. The minimal force had been dispatched to the distribution hub, a noisy diversion meant to draw Marco and his men away. Nina sat in her room, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was dressed in dark clothing, her hair pulled back tightly. The terrified woman who had signed a marriage contract months ago felt like a stranger. She was terrified now, yes, but it was a cold, focused fear. She had a purpose. At precisely 11 p.m., the lights in the estate flickered and died. Emergency power hummed instantly, bathing the corridors in a dim, eerie red glow. The assault had begun. Nina slipped out of her room, her movements silent. Her objective was the security control room, located just down the hall from Silas's office. She knew the layout intimately, having spent hours analyzing the estate's floor plans during her weeks of isolation. She moved quickly, hugging the walls. Distant shouts and the sudden, sharp crack of gunfire echoed from the lower levels. Silas's men had breached the perimeter. The sounds were terrifying, visceral reminders of the violence she was stepping into. She reached the corridor leading to the security room. It was empty. Silas was likely in his office, coordinating the attack, believing he had absolute control. She reached the heavy metal door of the security room. It required a keypad entry. She pulled a small device from her pocket, a scrambler Antonio had given her. She pressed it against the keypad. The numbers spun rapidly. A green light flashed, and the door clicked open. She slipped inside, locking the door behind her. The room was bathed in the blue light of a dozen monitors, displaying various angles of the estate. The chaos was unfolding in real time. She saw Antonio's men engaging with intruders in the grand foyer, a brutal, desperate struggle. She scrambled to the main console. Her task was simple in theory, complex in execution. Locate the master override program and lock Silas out of the system, restoring control to Antonio's loyalists. Her fingers flew across the keyboard. She wasn't a hacker, but she understood systems. She understood logic. She searched for the administrative back doors Antonio had briefed her on. Access denied. She gritted her teeth. Silas had changed the protocols. He was anticipating interference, just not from her. She stared at the screen, her mind racing. Think like an architect. Look for the structural flaw. Silas was meticulous, but he was also arrogant. He would have built a failsafe for himself, a back door he thought only he knew about. She began searching through the older, archived directories, bypassing the newer security layers. She looked for anomalies, files that didn't fit the standard naming conventions. There. A file labeled S_protocol_alpha. She clicked on it. A prompt appeared. Enter passcode. She paused. What would an arrogant man use as his master key? She thought back to the brief conversations she'd had with him, his mannerisms, his history with the family. He resented Antonio, but he worshipped the old ways, the history he felt Antonio was destroying. She typed in the founding year of the Falcone Syndicate. Incorrect. She tried the name of the first Don. Incorrect. One attempt remaining. Panic flared, cold and sharp. If she failed this, the system would lock down permanently, and Antonio would be blind. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds of the distant gunfire. What is the foundation he believes in? She remembered Antonio's journal. The betrayal, the rot. Silas believed he was the true heir, the one who understood the syndicate's core. She opened her eyes and typed, "Legacy." The screen flashed green. Access granted. A surge of triumph washed over her. She quickly initiated the override sequence. She locked down Silas's terminal, rerouted the camera feeds to Antonio's encrypted tablets, and disabled the electronic locks Silas had activated to trap Antonio's men. She had done it. She had turned the tide. She leaned back, exhaling a shaky breath, but the relief was short-lived. The heavy door to the security room shuddered. Someone was trying to force it open. "Open the door, Mrs. Falcone." It was Silas. His voice, normally calm and gravelly, was tight with fury. "I know you're in there. You've locked me out of my own system." Nina backed away from the door, her heart hammering. "It's over, Silas. Antonio knows everything. Your men at the hub are walking into a trap, and you're trapped here." "A minor setback," Silas sneered through the door. "Antonio is predictable. He fights with brute force. I fight with intellect. I may be locked out of the cameras, but I know this house better than he does. I know the blind spots. I know how to get to him." The heavy thud of something metallic striking the door echoed in the small room. He was trying to break the locking mechanism. "And I know how to get to you," Silas continued, his voice dripping with malice. "You thought you were clever, playing the hero. But you're just a liability he left unguarded." Another heavy thud. The metal groaned. Nina frantically scanned the room for a weapon, anything she could use to defend herself. But it was a room designed for surveillance, not combat. She heard a loud crack as the locking mechanism splintered. The door was giving way. She grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from a shelf, clutching it tightly, her knuckles white. She positioned herself behind the door, preparing to swing as soon as it opened. The door burst inward with a sickening crunch. Silas stepped into the room, a suppressed pistol in his hand. He looked older, frantic, his pristine facade shattered. He didn't see her immediately, his eyes drawn to the glowing monitors. It was the only advantage she had. She swung the flashlight with all her strength, aiming for his arm. The heavy metal connected with his wrist with a sickening thud. Silas cried out in pain, the pistol clattering to the floor. But he was an experienced man, hardened by years of violence. He recovered quickly, lunging at her. He backhanded her across the face, the force of the blow sending her crashing into the console. Her vision swam, the taste of copper filling her mouth. Silas grabbed her roughly by the hair, hauling her to her feet. He pressed the barrel of a secondary, smaller weapon against her temple. The cold steel sent a jolt of pure terror through her. "Clever girl," he hissed, his breath hot against her ear. "But not clever enough." He dragged her out of the security room and into the dim, red-lit corridor. He was using her as a shield. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had become the very thing Antonio had intended her to be, but for the enemy. "Let's go find your husband," Silas growled, forcing her forward. "Let's see how much his new foundation means to him when it's bleeding out in front of him." Silas dragged Nina through the labyrinthine corridors of the estate, the cold barrel of his gun a constant, terrifying pressure against her temple. The sounds of skirmishes were dying down. Antonio's loyalists, bolstered by the restored security feeds and unimpeded access, were systematically neutralizing the threat. But Silas wasn't interested in a tactical victory anymore. He wanted a decapitation strike. He hauled her towards the grand foyer, the heart of the house. The marble floors were slick with blood, the expensive art defaced by bullet holes. It was a scene of brutal, ugly reality. Antonio stood in the center of the devastation, surrounded by 3 of his most trusted men. He was breathing heavily, his white shirt stained with grime and a fresh dusting of crimson. He looked like a god of war, terrifying and magnificent in his fury. When he saw Silas emerge from the shadows, dragging Nina, he froze. The world seemed to stop spinning. The rage in his eyes instantly morphed into a raw, absolute panic. "Silas," Antonio said, his voice deceptively quiet, carrying across the echoing foyer. "Let her go. The game is up, Antonio," Silas yelled back, his voice trembling slightly with adrenaline and desperation. "Your men have secured the house, but I still hold the trump card. You lose her. You lose the narrative. You lose the stability you fought so hard to project. You think I care about the narrative right now?" Antonio took a slow, deliberate step forward. His men raised their weapons, aiming at Silas, but Antonio held up a hand, silently commanding them to hold their fire. The risk of hitting Nina was too high. "I don't care what you think, Antonio. I care about what is mine," Silas snarled. "The syndicate belongs to those who built it, not to a man who tries to sanitize it with architects and charity galas. You're weak." "I am not weak, Silas," Antonio said, his voice vibrating with suppressed power. "I am the man who trusted you, and you repaid that trust by murdering my brother." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Silas didn't deny it. "Leo was a liability. He was reckless. He would have dragged us all down. I did what was necessary." Antonio's face contorted with a grief so profound it was almost physically painful to witness. But he didn't attack. He kept his eyes locked on Silas, his focus entirely on Nina. "Let her go, Silas. This is between you and me. She has nothing to do with this." "She has everything to do with this," Silas countered, pressing the gun harder against Nina's head. She whimpered softly, a sound she couldn't suppress, and she saw Antonio flinch. She was the anomaly, the variable I couldn't control. She ruined everything. Nina, despite the terror paralyzing her, knew she had to do something. She couldn't let Antonio surrender to this man. She remembered the clock in the sunroom. Understand the stress points. Find the piece that isn't pulling its weight. Silas was focused entirely on Antonio. He was arrogant, believing he held all the power, but his grip on her arm, though tight, was shaking. He was old and he was terrified. She caught Antonio's eye. She needed him to understand. She couldn't speak, but she slightly shifted her weight, dropping her center of gravity, preparing to move. Antonio's gaze flickered to her slight movement. He understood. The briefest of nods, almost imperceptible, passed between them. "You want the syndicate, Silas?" Antonio yelled, his voice suddenly booming, drawing Silas's full attention. "You want the crown? It's yours. Take it." He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, lowering his weapon. Silas laughed, a harsh, triumphant sound. "You think it's that easy? You think I'll just let you walk away?" He shifted his grip on the gun, slightly loosening his hold on Nina to adjust his aim on Antonio. It was the opening she needed. With every ounce of strength she possessed, Nina slammed her heel backward, hard into Silas's shin. At the same moment, she threw her weight forward, violently twisting out of his grasp. Silas roared in pain and surprise, the gun firing wildly into the ceiling as he stumbled back. The movement was the signal. Antonio didn't hesitate. Before Silas could recover his balance and aim his weapon again, Antonio moved with terrifying speed. He didn't use his gun. He closed the distance in 3 strides and drove his fist into Silas's jaw with the force of a sledgehammer. Silas crumpled to the floor, unconscious before he hit the marble. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of the men in the room. Antonio stood over Silas's prone form for a long moment, his fists clenched, his chest heaving. Then he turned to Nina. She was trembling violently, the adrenaline crashing out of her system, leaving her weak and terrified. She sank to her knees on the bloody marble floor, wrapping her arms around herself. Antonio was beside her in an instant. He dropped to his knees, his hands hovering over her, afraid to touch her, afraid he might break her. "Nina," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Are you hurt? Did he hurt you?" She looked up at him, tears finally spilling over her cheeks. She saw the absolute terror in his eyes, a fear far greater than anything he had faced in battle. He wasn't the untouchable Mafia boss anymore. He was just a man terrified of losing the woman he loved. She reached out and placed her trembling hand against his cheek. "I'm okay," she sobbed. "I'm okay." He let out a choked sound and pulled her into his arms, crushing her against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. But she didn't care. She clung to him just as fiercely. "I thought I lost you," he murmured against her skin, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought I lost you." "You didn't," she whispered, her tears soaking his ruined shirt. "You didn't." They stayed like that for a long time, amidst the ruins of his empire, holding on to the only foundation that mattered. The cold, ruthless Mafia boss had finally crumbled, revealing a man capable of profound love and devastating vulnerability. And the ordinary restorer had proven herself stronger than any steel he could have ever built. The facade was gone. The truth remained. The aftermath of the night's violence was swift and decisive. With Silas incapacitated and the extent of his betrayal exposed to the remaining capos, the rebellion crumbled. Marco, realizing his plan had failed disastrously at the distribution hub, attempted to flee but was apprehended by Antonio's loyalists. The Morettis, sensing the sudden, absolute unification of the Falcone Syndicate, retreated back to Chicago. Their aggressive expansion halted. The Falcone estate, however, bore the scars of the conflict. The grand foyer was cordoned off, the marble stained, the air heavy with the scent of bleach and lingering cordite. It was a physical manifestation of the shattered illusions Antonio had lived by. He spent the next 3 days consolidating his power, rooting out the remaining sympathizers, and securing his borders. He was ruthless, efficient, and completely focused. But the coldness was gone. The icy detachment he had used as armor had melted, replaced by a quiet, determined intensity. Nina gave him space. She understood the massive undertaking required to rebuild an empire from the inside out. She remained in her room, nursing the bruises from Silas's attack, finding strange comfort in the quiet of the house now that the threat was neutralized. The oppressive tension was gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion. On the 4th evening, Antonio came to her room. He looked terrible, exhausted, pale, shadows bruised beneath his eyes. He still wore the immaculate suits, but they hung slightly looser on his frame. He stood in the doorway, hesitating, as if unsure of his welcome. "May I come in?" Nina nodded, sitting up on the edge of the bed. "Of course." He entered, closing the door softly behind him. He didn't sit. He stood near the window, looking out at the darkened ocean. The silence stretched between them, comfortable but loaded with unspoken words. "The syndicate is secure," he finally said, his voice rough. "Silas has been dealt with. The immediate threat is neutralized." "I'm glad," Nina replied softly. He turned to face her. "I have spent my entire life building walls, Nina, believing that if I was strong enough, cold enough, I could protect the things I cared about. I thought vulnerability was a weakness that would kill me." He walked slowly toward her, stopping a few feet away. "But I was wrong. The walls didn't protect me. They blinded me. They isolated me until I couldn't see the enemies standing right beside me. And they almost cost me the one thing that actually matters." He knelt in front of her, the powerful, terrifying Antonio Falcone, lowering himself entirely. He took her hands in his touch gentle, almost reverent. "You saved my life, Nina. Not just from Silas, but from myself. You showed me that a foundation built on fear and lies will always collapse. You showed me that true strength lies in connection, in trust." Nina looked down at him, her heart swelling. "You thought I was just a shield." He smiled, a sad, self-deprecating smile. "I was a fool. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You saw the broken pieces of my world, and instead of running, you helped me put them back together." He looked deeply into her eyes, all his defenses completely stripped away. "I cannot offer you a simple life, Nina. This world, this life, it will always be dangerous. There will always be shadows. But I can offer you honesty. I can offer you partnership. I can offer you my absolute devotion." He paused, taking a deep, ragged breath. "I love you, Nina. Not as a transaction, not as a convenience. I love the woman who fixes clocks and sees the truth beneath the lies. I love you." The words, spoken with such raw, unvarnished sincerity, broke the last of Nina's own defenses. The fear, the isolation, the doubt, it all washed away. She slipped off the bed, kneeling on the floor to meet him at his level. She cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs gently tracing the exhausted lines around his eyes. "I know the life is complicated, Antonio," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "But I don't want a simple life. I want a real one, and I want it with you." She leaned in and kissed him. It wasn't the hesitant, performative kiss they had shared for the cameras. It was deep, desperate, and entirely real. It was the sealing of a promise, the foundation of a new structure built on truth, trust, and a love forged in the crucible of survival. When they finally pulled apart, Antonio rested his forehead against hers, a long, shuddering sigh escaping him. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the crushing weight of the empire on his shoulders. He felt grounded. He felt home. "So," he murmured, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. "What do we build now?" Nina smiled back, her eyes shining. "Something strong. Something that lasts. We build it together." The path ahead would not be easy. The shadows of Antonio's world would always linger. But as they held each other in the quiet room, the noise and violence of the syndicate fading into the background, they knew they had survived the storm. The old foundation had been shattered, but the new one, built not on fear and deceit, but on mutual respect and an unbreakable bond, would weather whatever came next. They were no longer the Mafia boss and his decoy. They were partners, and they were finally, truly unbreakable. Thank you for listening to this story. If you enjoyed this journey of trust, resilience, and finding love in the darkest of places, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. Your support allows us to continue creating these original, emotionally driven stories. Let us know in the comments what kind of story you'd like to hear next. Until then, stay safe and keep believing in the power of a strong foundation.